Good afternoon, and welcome to our discussion for the origins of the current Hindu observance of Navaratri amidst the ancient war rites of the Indo-Europeans. Now, for those non-Hindus out there in the audience, Navaratri is the 9, Nava, nights, Ratri, of the Goddess Durga. These are, in essence, war rites, and in older times more expressly so. They build up toward famed observances for victory upon the 10th, Vijaya Dashami, and of course the worship of the weapons, Astra Puja. Now, as for why I'm phrasing all of this within an Indo-European context rather than just a Hindu one, if you haven't noticed, it's rather what we do here at Arya Akasha. However, it's also done with some particular purposes in mind. On the one hand, that is to say the European side of things, we have often encountered some insistent lines which try and tell us that pretty much anything to do with goddess worship, goddess saliency, goddess observances is somehow non-Indo-European. This is incorrect, and the fact that we can demonstrate strong, coherent concordancy between the rites and observances and goddess figures of the Hindu sphere on the one hand, and the European spheres on the other, help to show the archaic and shared Indo-European originations for both. The same can also be said going the other way for the Hindu side of things, because over here we frequently encounter scurrilous suggestions that seemingly anything to do with the Shakta sphere, that is to say goddess-oriented devotion, goddess figures, so on and so forth, has been purloined, apparently, from non-Arya and often anti-Vedic tribes, practices, so on and so forth. The fact, as I say, that we can demonstrate strong concordancy between the Indo-European understandings over in Europe and those extant in Hindu India, once again helps us to demonstrate that this is not the case, and these elements, these essences, these goddess understandings are very much an intrinsic part of the ancient Indo-European belief. But enough about that. We are here to celebrate, exalt, and explain this observance and the Devi, not to give free airtime to her would-be critics. Now, as applies Navaratri itself, there are two major ones in the year. Chaitra Navratri, which occurs, as may be somewhat unsurprising, in the month of Chaitra, which is about March or April in the Western solar calendrical time, and the current Navaratri, which is in the month of Ashwini, this being Sharada Navratri, the Autumnal Navratri, and which is, for a number of reasons, the rather big one. Now, there are two strands which have gone into making the current Navaratri observance. The first of these concerns those aforementioned war rites, and the second, the times of transition, we might say, between the light and dark halves of the year, oriented, broadly speaking, around the spring and also the autumnal equinoxes, which are roughly about the 23rd of September, as applies the autumnal one in the northern hemisphere, the spring one down here in the south, and the spring equinox is around the 20th of March, and of course the other way around for the southern hemisphere. And in both directions you'll find there's quite a strong Chandika/Chamunda saliency, but we'll discuss that in due course. Now, in terms of our European cognates for these war rites, the major ones tend to be oriented towards that spring equinox, broadly speaking. The Roman observance of the Quinquatria for Minerva is carried out in late March, around about the 19th or the 20th. It's about 5 days after the Ides of March, if I remember correctly. It features also the Turblistrium, or Turbistria, wherein the sacral trumpets and perhaps the war horns of the Roman army are to be blessed, and an offering made to Mars, whose month it is, hence why we call it March, from Martius, because, of course, as you'd imagine, there's a strong military saliency to all of this. It appears that, at least in Europe, the archaic campaign season, or time of warfare and raiding, kicked off about then, for obvious calendrical/seasonal reasons, because, the weather is fine enough to actually do these sorts of things without being bogged down or alternatively running out of food in rather dire conditions, as might be the case during winter. Now, it's not just the Romans who had such an observance oriented towards a war goddess at this particular point of the year. The work of Bede, the chronicler well, he's a Christian, but he was trying to sort of make sense of the Germanic year, so to speak, in the work which we're sort of looking at here. He made reference to what was known as Hrēþ mōnaþ, which is to say the month of Hrēþ or Rheda. Now, very little is actually known about this particular goddess figure. We've basically just got the name and some fragmentary inferences which have been drawn about her. One likely explanation for the etymology for Rheda is that she probably means something along the lines of the well-renowned, possibly the victorious. However, we would make reference to the work of Grimm in his well-known Teutonic mythology, a very appropriate name, Grimm, for the thing we're about to be discussing, wherein he notes a correlation between the Anglo-Saxon adjective of Hrēþ and the Latin term of crudelis, although he also suggests a possibility for victoriosus. Now, crudelis, while it does share an etymology with, well, crude in English, is better understood to mean something along the lines of cruel or merciless. The reason why I mention this is because we're well familiar with this concept in the relevant cognate occurrence in Sanskrit. The root, of course, being pai kruros, which means bloody. And this gives us both Sanskrit krura as well as the aforementioned English cruel. Indeed, the Sanskrit is, as we have come to anticipate, rather more expansive in its field of definition. It's not only cruel and bloody, but also wrathful, pitiless, savage, formidable, frightful, violent, aggressive, harsh, and rather barbaric. We also often encounter krura or krurae in relation to both Rudra and his wife. For example, within the famed Sri Durga Chaitra Sharada Navratri, which is to say the great Durga 108 name hymnal, and in similar fashion in the Kalika Sahasranama Stotra. There we hear Ameya Vikrama Krura, which is to say the limitless, Ameya, power or valor or heroism, Vikrama, and we also may infer that similarly limitless is the Krura quality, judiciously meted out towards the justly reviled foe. So it makes quite some sense to encounter, as applies Bede's reference, Grimm's suggestion that the appropriate interpretation for the name of this goddess figure, whose month it is in relation to March, and who's obviously got quite a lot to do with war rites, that crudelis would be part of the explanation, as would be this victoriosus, because this cruel goddess, this wrathful goddess, this merciless goddess, grants the victory which is being sought with the rites in question. Now, at this juncture, we would also make mention of something which appears to have existed amidst the more Icelandic, sort of northern Germanic end of things, which is to say Sigurblot. Sigur, of course, meaning victory, blot, a blood sacrifice. Now, per Sturluson's commentary on this is oriented towards Odin, which doesn't obviously seem immediately to suggest a goddess observant sort of rite. However, we would make mention to the fact that in terms of this Quinquatria observance which the Romans had, first up we have the directly earlier sort of rites towards Bacchus, which immediately preceded. And second, in the context of what's going on with this Minerva observance, we first up have Apollo being referenced reasonably prominently, and Apollo correlates rather well to Rudra and Odin, as of course we won't go into the details and all of that. But second, as applies some of the detailing for our Navaratri observances, there is a strong saliency to do with Ardra, which is to say Rudra in astrological sort of orientation as the great archer. It correlates with the Sirius, with some bits and pieces with Orion. Again, we won't go into all of the depth and detail with this here, although a bit later we shall be meeting how this pertains to Rama. Anyway, so in terms of Sigurblot being written about by Sturluson, despite the fact that it's also slightly later in the year in summer, which we can probably plausibly explain via the fact that it being rather colder in Iceland, they had to wait a bit longer in order for the season of campaign to actually be able to kick off in earnest. So, to tie things together there, we have both a Germanic sphere and a classical sphere attestation. For war rites, around about the same time of the year, occurring and with a goddess orientation. Now, to bring this over to the Vedic sphere, what we have, once again, is an occurrence for war rites taking place roughly around this, sort of this March-April sort of period. Now, one moment while I find the appropriate thing. Right, so, a good way of sort of demonstrating this is what we find in Shatapada Brahmana 2.1.2. It also occurs in Taittiriya Brahmana 1.1.2.4.6. The verse in question for the Shatapada Brahmana here is verse 17 in the Egerling translation. Thereupon the gods assembled and said, wonderfully, Chitram, indeed it has fared with us who have slain so many enemies. Hence the wonderful nature, Chitratva, of the asterism Chitra. And verily, wonderfully it fares with him, and he slays his rivals, his spiteful enemy. Whosoever knowing this, sets up his fires under Chitra. A Kshatriya, therefore, should especially desire to take advantage of this asterism, since such a one is anxious to strike, to vanquish his enemies. Now, as a brief sort of tangent upon this subject, the Taittiriya Brahmana verse which I mentioned earlier, that being Taittiriya Brahmana 1.1.2.4-6, it has a rather different suite of conceptry to what's actually going on in the Shatapada Brahmana verse which we've just sort of briefly quoted there. Without going into the full depth and detail about it, the Shatapada Brahmana verse is basically how a Kshatriya would approach things, which is to say with direct force and thunderbolt smiting things carried out by Indra. The Taittiriya Brahmana verse, by contrast, actually features a more Brahminical approach to things, and therefore, I'm not going to say sort of sorcery, because that's not the right way to look at these sorts of things, but the propitiation in rites in order to carry out the judicious smiting of one's foes. In fact, there's a very interesting direct linkage to a rather vital Atharva Veda suite of hymnals for the blessing of an army. I think one of the translations has it as, but it actually features the most archaic occurrence for the concept of Indra's net, or Indra's web, which in some research which I've done rather recently, seems to directly link into the suite of conceptry which you find, say, in the forerunning to the Battle of Clontarf in the Saga of Burnt Njal, and the Valkyries which are carrying out a very similar suite of battlefield observances, if you like. But more upon that at some other time in the future. We'll get on to it when I've done a bit more sort of fleshing out of the relevant conceptry. Anyway, back to our main theme. The point is, as we can demonstrate here, Chaitra has an archaic warfare saliency going on for it in terms of what must have underpinned the Chaitra Navratri observances. We can additionally attest this, I would suspect, when it comes to the situation of the first suite of Navaratri observances, which are attested for us in the context of the king Surath and the merchant known as Samadhi. Now, in the Devi Mahatmyam, which we'll be quoting, it's section 13 in the Devadatta Kali translation, the king and the merchant settled on a riverbank and engaged in spiritual practice, chanting the supreme hymn to the Devi. When they had fashioned an earthen image of her on the riverbank, the two of them worshipped the Devi with flowers, incense, fire, and libations of water. Now fasting, now restraining their senses, with minds constant in concentration, they made offerings sprinkled with the blood of their own bodies. When they had worshipped her in this way with self-restraint for 3 years, Chandika, the support of the universe, was well pleased. She appeared before them and spoke. The Devi said, "That which you desire, O king, the delight of your family, receive all that from me. Well pleased, I will grant it." Markandeya said, "Thereupon the king chose a kingdom, imperishable even in another lifetime, and also his own kingdom here, to be reclaimed by force from his enemy's control." And then the wise merchant, dispassionate in mind, chose that knowledge which severs attachment from I and mine. The Devi said, "In a few days, O king, you will reclaim your own kingdom. When your enemies are slain, thenceforth, I should say, it will assuredly be yours." Now, end quotations. Indeed, the next lines also declare, prophesizers do not seem quite right somehow, as it would be a prediction, rather than a commitment to action to make things come about. That Hrēþ, the king, shall become in his next phase of existence the son of the sun, Vivasvat, and the Manu, that is the lord of the age. Fourth Samadhi achieves his sought-for absolute freedom. And I have always thought it rather worth remarking upon, that last point, precisely because we are so used to the inveteratory grasping or ultra-materialist merchant archetypes. So the one that does the exact opposite is a very refreshing shift. There is nuance and depth in the mythic world after all, or rather, in the human presentations thereof, but I digress. Now, what we've just encountered there, as I've said, is a king, Hrēþ, looking to reclaim the kingdom which he has been ousted and sent into exile from. He does this via the propitiation of the goddess, Chandika. So, keep that in mind as applies our future sort of delvings into this area. What we are now going to do, however, is we are going to flip over to the other strand of things which have gone into these rites which we're under discussion at the moment, the navaratri processional. One moment while I bring up the relevant archaic text. Right, so, Sharapada Brahmana 2629, in the context of discussing the Triambaka rites to Rudra, which are carried out at a crossroads, Triambaka, of course, being the three-eyed one. Funnily enough, the notion of a three-eyed understanding for the Sky Father is not a purely Hindu one. It also shows up in the Hellenic sphere, as we've frequently discussed, via the situation of Zeus Triophthalmos, that is to say, Zeus the three-eyed one. There's also a potential three-eyed Apollo manifestation, but more upon that some other time. Now, to quote the verse in question, once again in the Egerling translation, he offers with the text, which is to say from the White Yajurveda 357a, "This is thy share, O Rudra. Graciously accept it together with thy sister Ambika, Svaha." Ambika, indeed, is the name of his, Rudra's sister, and this share belongs to him conjointly with her. And because that share belongs to him, conjointly with the woman, three. Therefore these oblations are called Triambaka. Thereby, then, he delivers from Rudra's power the descendants that have been born unto him. Now, in the Taittiriya Brahmana rendition for this, which is to say Taittiriya Brahmana 1610.4 in the Muir translation, we encounter the following additional detail. His sister Ambika is the autumn. With her he smites or kills. She is expressly hailed as having potency with regard to disease. Per the commentaries of Maridara, which is on the, White Yajurveda 352, and the Taittiriya Brahmana's renditions upon the subject, as we've just mentioned. Sorry, that's not in the Muir quotation, that's my own annotation, my bad. Now, as applies where we're going with this. First up, this resonates once again very directly with what we see with the Quinquatria rites dedicated to Minerva. Therein, Ovid, in his Fasti, which is to say the third section thereof, makes direct reference to Phoebus, that is to say Apollo, and the healing arts when it comes to disease. Again, directly correlate with this particular observance taking place, A, in March, B, around the time of that equinox. I would say it's the spring equinox, which I suppose is for the Northern Hemisphere, but also B, with regard to that Rudra saliency alongside a goddess situation as well. And as I mentioned previously, Minerva is a very interesting figure because she is partially running upon the underlying template tree for, Durga, Vach, so on and so forth, but also at the same time, especially as you can see via that name, Minerva, relative to the Manu, who is one of those Rudra forms, the most formidable war form, there's also a sort of Rudran concept tree going on as well. And in the lengthy article I wrote earlier this year upon all of this, we explored this with regard to the astrological side of things, and her slaying of the figure whom she flays in order to provide her fine cloak. There's also a Hrēþa situation, which may in fact mean clad in goatskin, which is very suspiciously on point for all this, I'm sure you'd have to agree. Once again, I digress. Anyway, so, as we've just seen, when it comes to the Taittiriya Brahmana presentation for this Rudran rite, we find mentioned that it's not only Rudra and his potency which is honoured at the crossroads in question, but also that it is his female counterpart, that's how I choose to translate sister for a number of reasons, Ambika, who is mentioned here, who has potency over disease and is correlate as the autumn. Now, autumn of course being currently what it is in the Northern Hemisphere around this Sharada observance. In the later Puranika scripture, that is to say Devi Bhagavata Purana 3.26, and it's in the Vijnananda translation, we find the following. O king, hear about the vow of auspicious Navratra. This has to be performed with loving devotion in the vernal season, but its special season is autumn. The two seasons, autumn and spring, are famous as the teeth of Yama, the god of death, and these are the two seasons, very hard for persons to cross over. Therefore, every good-faring man should everywhere perform this vow very carefully. O king, the people are very much afflicted with various terrible diseases in these two seasons, autumn and spring, and many lose their lives during these portions of the year. Therefore, the wise should unquestionably worship with great devotion the Chandika Devi in these auspicious months of Chaitra and Ashvin. So, as you can see, right there we have the notion of this Devi worship in Chaitra and Ashvin directly correlate with the understanding which we have, viz. The autumnal observances as found in the Brahmanas on the one hand. This is particularly around the sort of the disease thing and sort of securing safeguarding from various forms of peril. But also, on the other hand, when it comes to this Chaitra observance, it correlates with the situation which we have found as applies these war rites, which should be goddess-oriented per our European understandings of things. And you can see how these things fit together, and it's a case of both rather than either for both the Ashvini and Chaitra situations. Now, there's one further detail which is vital for us to examine here, and that concerns the mythic explanation for why it is that we have this situation of Sharada Navratri. I suspect rather strongly that part of what has actually occurred here is that due to the climatological differences in the Indian subcontinent as compared to what's going on in Europe, the major campaign season has wound up becoming this autumnal period rather than necessarily the spring period which we'd expect with Chaitra. So that is to say, there are still Chaitra sort of war observances, as we've of course seen, but at the same time, it's these Sharada observances which have become much more prominent as applies the worship of the goddess and the warfare purpose for which these are undertaken. Now, in terms of explaining that, what effectively happens is Lord Rama, which is to say that particular avatar of Vishnu, who has a strong suite of Indra-oriented resonances going on in his particular presentation in the Ramayana, as we've discussed elsewhere, and of course, as mōnaþ Ramjini has put a lot of effort into demonstrating. So, as a brief sort of side note on this, people often try and make out a number of things about Indra worship and the lack thereof as applies modern Hinduism. These tend to be false and propagandistic in the orientation, because for a start, Indra worship still continues, point number one. But point number two, a lot of the conceptry which one would associate with Indra worship, we still do. It's just that it's Lord Rama that tends to have pride of place as applies this. The fervour is still there, the fire is still there, and even where it's not directly, literally oriented towards Vishnu, we still carry out very correlate understandings and ethos. But once again, I digress. Although I don't quite digress, because in many cases in the Brahmanas, as we've seen, the actual templates for the invocation of various gods or goddess carrying out certain things is Indra himself carrying out rites to set the sort of the mythic template, which in Eliadian terms winds up being eternally returned, mythically recurred, out for us here in sidereal terms to then actively emulate moving forward, if that makes sense. So, as applies the Sharada, 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 Sharada the best account for this, which I've run across, is given for us in the, well, it's basically an alternative Ramayana account, which is Devi-oriented, as of course one would probably anticipate. What it details for us is a situation whereby Devi has incarnated in a number of ways in the course of the story. They're all sort of Devi incarnations. So both, Sita, which is to say as Rama's wife, but also as Lankeshwari, which is to say the goddess that is at Lanka, Ravana's capital, sort of empowering him and his empire, because he too is a king, and a very pious one with some flaws, it must be noted, who therefore has propitiated the goddess, and that's partially why he's been able to build this immense empire in the first place. But he's also causing a lot of problems via ultimately his impiety. He's led to nature and other things being horrendously out of whack. So therefore, the goddess wishes to withdraw this Lankeshwari favour from Ravana. And so she sends both Hanuman as an incarnation of Rudra to basically go and get this incarnation Lankeshwari back, but also Rama to go and get his wife, also an incarnation of Devi obviously, back from Ravana, who's kidnapped her. Now, the difficulty is that Ravana, as we've said, has the ostensible favour of Devi because he's done all of the proper rites and observances throughout the year earlier on, however you want to phrase it. There therefore has to be some very interesting loophole exploitation, you might say, by Rama in order to win over the blessing, the Shakti of Devi, so as to be victorious in his upcoming contest with Ravana. So she basically slips him some hints, some guidance, to undertake what eventually becomes the, how do I phrase this? The Akala Bodhana, which is to say the out of time. Meaning the opposite of, Kala of course being time, Bodhana, it means to sort of awaken, to make aware, like one of the two etymologies for bid in modern English, sort of I bid you sort of welcome, that kind of thing, I think, or maybe the other one, so notice that one, my bad. So this Akala Bodhana sort of operation which Rama is undertaking is made up of both him worshipping the goddess as a Pitr, that is to say as an ancestor spirit. Pitru-paksha is the fortnight of the ancestor shades, which immediately precedes our current Sharada Navratri. So that takes place during that particular observance, when the barriers, you might say, are weaker between this world and the world of the dead, beyond which, of course, that veil sort of covers on and so forth. The other part of this is Brahma, acting as a Brahmin, as of course one may be rather unsurprised to find, undertaking further propitiations, especially with regard to the period in which Ardra, that is to say Rudra once again, is ascendant in the sky. As I said, there's a saliency we're not quite exploring here. We have looked at it in far greater detail in other written works, so go look up those if you're interested. Now, what this enables is Rama to basically gain the benefit of what would otherwise be the Chaitra Navratri suite of observances, but in this time of Sharada, rather when Ravana is not expecting it, you'd have to say. This is why it's the Akala Bodhana observance of Navratri, because it's out of the usual time, it's out of the usual sync of events. The Devi is supposed to be asleep at this particular juncture in the sort of the autumnal period, but because of Rama's proper and pious actions and the blessing of the Devi to make it possible, she comes alive and awakes and grants him the victory, the empowerments that he is intending to seek, so as to be able to beat Ravana and reclaim his wife in the war that is soon to be won at the climax of this Sharada Navratri observance. So, therefore, what you will find in various parts of India is the carrying out of sort of bonfire oblations of a figure representing Ravana and things like that as part of the reenactment or reoccurrence of the observance in its mythic templatry, which we've just finished discussing. Now, as I said, these operations are oriented around, well, there's a number of different ways of going about it, depending on where you are and your particular tradition. So, for instance, there's the Navadurga processional, which tends to be the main one that, well, we tend to sort of observe. When I say we, I mean people I sort of, I'm aware of and sort of engaged with. I don't mean sort of the Hindu sphere all up, because it's a fascinatingly diverse sphere, as I'm sure we all know. We aren't going to cover that particular processional in this video. What we will say is that the underlying element to this, especially more archaically, so going back a few centuries and in the context of royal and tantrika sort of observances, and these two things are actually strongly aligned, is the observance around, as we said, Chandika, Chamunda, those sorts of wrathful and very terrific looking deific expressions. The interesting thing about these is that they bear very, very strong resemblance to what's going on with the dark half of the sort of the deathly facing encountered in the European sphere, as applies those transitions around sort of the light half of the earth, the dark half, and sort of vice versa. So, for instance, the figure of the Kailash, as applies to Celtic sphere, and I do apologise to the Celtic people in the audience for no doubt mispronouncing that egregiously. But also in terms of Demeter Ernias, Demeter Malenia, which is to say the black and furious form of Demeter, who turns up represented as an old woman with this sort of this black sort of visage or veil. The particle in question coming from Proto-Indo-European Kel, which also informs our Sanskrit Kal, which is to say Kali. You see how it all starts to fit together. Now I could go on at great length about this, but this was only supposed to be a 20-minute video, and I see we're cropping up above half an hour right now. The point I'm making here is quite a simple one. That, as I say, there's these two strands for the transition points between the times of sort of light and life and so on and so forth, and sort of dark, death, sort of those ends of things, which occur around the spring and autumn equinoxes, which feature a goddess figure who alternatively adopts or discards this rather wrathful sort of visage, this wrathful, dark, old crone-like visage, in fact, I would have to say. And on the other hand, we have these war rites, which, while they have been archaically obviously oriented around a spring beginning to campaign season, they also appear to have had strong orientation around the autumnal end of things, as applies the Hindu understanding. These have shifted in terms of the major sort of campaign ethos approach in the Indian side of things, to build upon another occasion when the Devi is also salient. So, in terms of the spring rites, which we see visit this Quinquatria business, and more especially this Hrēþ situation of the Anglo-Saxon, Germanic sphere, we find this crudelis, deific being invoked in spring for success in war. We also find, as applies that transition to winter, the goddess taking on this fearsome, formidable, and rather cruel, etc., or wrathful visage. So it's the same goddess somewhat, doing slightly different things, but still correlated, what you might have to say, with death in both directions, and also possibly with the shoots. The shoots, I must say, of new growth in terms of plants, etc. The spears, indeed, possibly of asparagus, which would be coming out of the ground. And you can see with Shakambari, the Devi who bears shoots and is quite a prominent archer, the correlation also in terms of our end of things. On the other end of things in the Hindu sphere, the saliency around autumn for this, this transition, this Ambika figure, this Chandika figure who is quite deathly and must be propitiated to avoid death, or possibly to bring it about to one's foes, is very archaic indeed, and seems to be shared also with what's going on with the Chaitra equivalent, viz. The Quinquatria, as we've seen in that Latin sphere, viz. The disease potency, Phobos is practicing, so on and so forth. So in that regard, the Sharada Navratri observance which we're currently engaged in is not novel, even though there's been a slight change of emphasis to more strongly talk about the war rites side of things, which isn't quite so prominent as applies the more archaic concept tree, where it's basically sort of death by an array of means, a particular disease, as applies the Vedic end of things. But it does build upon something which is already there, both in the Vedic sphere and also in terms of the Western Indo-European spheres of Europe. So, as we can see, the fact that we have identifiably the same understandings of goddess in both the European and Vedic spheres, and post-Vedic, I should make a point of adding. And the fact that we have these similar and coherent coterminous purposes, as applies both the European and Vedic spheres, would therefore seem to show that once again, there's no novel thing which has no Indo-European foundation going on here. There may be said to be some slight adaptation to local circumstance, and as we can see, there's the Sigurblot, which was observed in Iceland. Well, due to the fact that things melt rather sort of later on in the year by a few weeks because they're that far further north, yes, they did wind up altering when their campaign season kicked off, as compared to when the Romans kicked off their campaign season in the much more balmy Italian weather, much in sort of March rather than sort of like high summer. The adaptation of things to local calendrical, well, not quite calendrical, but local seasonal circumstances is not innovation in whole cloth. It is not borrowing from non-Indo-European elements. It is simply the transmission of that essence, that shared Indo-European essence, to slightly different local climes and its adaptation to that particular soil, whether it's in India or whether it is in Iceland. So, with all of that long and involved suite of conceptry out of the way, I will of course be attending upon reasonably proper, Navaratri observances this evening. But I would like to close with something which may perhaps be a bit European, which is to say how Ovid chose to close his section, oriented about the Quinquatria rites to Minerva of the Fasti. Now, in the Latin, and I apologize to various people, including my old Latin teachers at high school, for the pronunciation. Quacumque trahis ratione vocabula pallas, pro ducibus nostris aegida semper habe, which, per Fraser's translation, from whatsoever source thou dost derive the title, O Pallas, do thou hold thine aegis ever before our leaders. Or in the Klein translation, by whatever logic your titles derive, Pallas, shield our leaders with your aegis forever. Now, the logic there of the protection and defense of the king by Pallas using her aegis, a feature shared with Zeus, I might add, that particular aegis, the storm facing, we might sort of say. It's very relevant, especially because it's a Gorgonean, so therefore cognate with Gora and Sanskrit, the Gora facings of Shiva, the Gora facings of Devi, being, as we know, Bhairava, Kali, Mahakal, you get the idea. But it's very relevant for exactly what the Sharada Navratri rites were supposed to do in a Tantrika and royal context in the Hindu sphere. Protect the king, empower the king, so that he'd be able to carry out his accordant duty as a result. We would actually conclude, there was a bit of a false sort of conclusion there, with the further element which Ovid had chosen to include there. Mille dia est operum, certe dia carminis illa est. Si mereor studies adsit amica meis. Which is to say, goddess of the thousand works, resolved goddess of the sung invocation that she is, if I am worthy, in my quests, may she be a close comrade unto me. Jai Mata Di.